Powell. I'm from Cradle Care Fostering, and we've been providing fostering services for about 25 years. We're actually in our 25th year. And today's really discussion around supporting and caring for children with life-limiting conditions who may be obviously at palliative care stages with our foster carers. I've been joined today by Sue, who's one of our foster carers and been with us for many, many years, and has got a great deal of experience of caring for children and sadly losing children who have got palliative care needs. But I'm sure Sue will also jump in and actually tell some of her experiences and what's it like fostering in terms of supporting children. I just want to recognise that it's not only Credo Care who do this, lots of foster carers support children with life-limiting conditions around the country in various places. But for today, it's about how we're doing that at Credo Care and what we can hopefully bring to the discussion. So all of our children are looked after that come to us, and we work with around maybe 50 local authorities, probably about 43 regularly placing with us, and those sorts of relationships have been developed over a long period of time, and it wasn't our main area. We've always supported children with additional needs and disabilities. It's that as we've provided more placements for children with a life-limiting condition or palliative care needs, you end up putting in the structures around that. Doesn't always work, but you try and put the structures in that fit with matching the children to the right family, providing the level of support, training, and I'll come on to training a bit more. It's a crucial part, but making sure that where you can, you find the right family for that particular child, and it gives an opportunity to stepping down or stepping out of a child maybe having to live in hospital or even hospice care for some time or in residential care. And so we've found over probably about the last 6 or 7 years, certainly over the last 5, that's become a major feature of children coming to Credo Care, and it's a significant part of the work we're doing. So what does that look like? In part, some of the things that we've kind of learned to develop is having things like child-specific training in place with our foster carers, our support workers. So we have about 60 support workers who work with our foster carers and with the children to try and engage and support them on a weekly basis at various levels with activities or particular tasks. And those child-specific training has been one of the ones that I'm quite proud of, actually, that the agency have been able to work with the carers and work with our nurse trainers and paediatric physios to get that sort of service in place to make children's placement with us safe, secure, and frankly making the opportunity for family-based care a reality. For some children, we might be their only and first placement after being born and having to come out of hospital. So some of that is actually supported by people like Sue, and we have not only the nurse trainers, we have carer mentors, whether that's carer mentors, so all of our foster carers have mentoring as an opportunity, but we also have bereavement mentors, and Sue's also a bereavement mentor to us as well. So I don't know, Sue, do you want to tell us a bit about yourself?
Yes, thank you. Thanks, Richard. Hello, everybody. Well, I first came to Credo 16 years ago. I knew I wanted to look after children with complex needs, but hadn't even thought about end of life or, children dying in my care. However, my very first full-time placement was a little baby that had heart failure. Now, I remember going to pick her up and being told that she was, her prognosis was very poor. And yes, it was very tricky, and she did pass away by the time she was 4 months old. But in that moment, being in the hospice, I knew this is what I wanted to do. I wanted to do specifically palliative care, because I could totally get what all the nurses and the support workers at the hospice were, I got that what their their need was to help these children. So then I went on with Credo to care for another 4 children, sadly, that became end of life. Another 2 were expected to only have short lives. And the others, unfortunately, because they were life limited, they did become very, very poorly, and did pass away. Now, that has come with many, many challenges, but it has been an absolute privilege, a real privilege to be able to be part of these children's lives. The families, we have many families that we support along the way, and Richard also will explain about how tricky that can be with some of our birth families. Children come into care for all sorts of different reasons, and to be part of this journey with some of the families is quite amazing, actually, as well. It's not all negative, because these children are in care. The training we've had from Credo has been outstanding, and like I say, I'm still here 16 years later, and I am shouting from the rooftops to be part of this agency, because to be able to do what we do is just nothing short of, it is a real privilege to be able to care for these children until the very end, or throughout their life. I've gone on to adopt one of my children, who is palliative, and she is sitting beside me, and she's now 6. I don't know what her prognosis really is, but we enjoy her for however long we've got. But yes, I can only say what a real privilege experience it is, and it comes with many challenges, as Richard will probably go on to explain, and I can sort of jump in as well. Yes, so that is my journey, really, from start to finish, plus lots of children in between that I've done respite for the carers, to provide the experience that I've got.
Thank you, Sue. That's really insightful, and I think the what I do hear a lot of is the privilege it is to be able to offer a family and a child. And not all of our children come in because birth parents are antagonistic or a challenge or a difficulty. Some children are just not able to go back home or live with their birth parents for any particular reason, and fostering is a real opportunity. So sometimes there's some really great relationships excuse me, between birth family and our foster carers, as there is with lots of foster carers, but sometimes that challenge isn't there, and sadly even some of the children may be in their condition due to the actions of a family member, in terms of causing injury. So in regards though to Sue as an example, and I'm not going to spread this butter very wide, Sue, on you, which is trying to find Sues is absolutely our challenge, because we can only have families fostering children with palliative care needs when they're very special. And I think anybody caring for a child with a palliative care or life limited condition, wherever they are, is special. And so trying to find special families is one of the biggest challenges we have. And the other side of it, Sue alluded to it, you lose 10% of your carers, partly because they're adopting children, they fall in love and they take out special guardianship orders, let alone the ones that retire or maybe move somewhere else, maybe move to another agency or to the local authority. But there's always that turnover. So you're always trying to try and keep filling in new families. And it's not for everybody. Not all foster carers want to have the start of their fostering career being, would you like to look after a child with high medical needs, high disabilities, potentially life-limiting conditions, or that they are likely to pass away in your care? Because you've got the circumstances of their own birth children, their own family, and their own personal circumstances. So families do come to us who are new foster carers who sadly have had their own birth child pass away, and maybe 2 or 3 years later, sometimes they don't want to stop. They actually feel they've got something to give and want to come back into something, and that is fostering. So a credit to anybody who's fostering a child with a life-limiting condition. So where does that take us? Takes us, as I said, onto that matching process, really careful. A lot of work is done between the local authority, ourselves, the social workers, and the foster carers, and our nurse trainers, and certainly with the other health professionals around that child. So there's always a challenge if you've got a child who's maybe coming from Manchester to Suffolk, or Suffolk to Norfolk, or Norfolk over to Hertfordshire. You've got to deal with lots of different health authorities who might have certain condition and agreements around continuing healthcare funding or the equipment that's going into a household. And so you end up with that whole process often being a very slow process. We very rarely take children on an emergency basis at Credo Care. It tends to be planned, and it's planned over a long period of time, and sometimes over 3, 4, 5 months, because you're trying to introduce that child-specific training to get it right for all those around that child. And the other thing that's going to be there is support and respite. Not always easy to be achieved, but where we can, we are trying to put in support workers and respite carers for those families that want it and need it. And that involves sometimes maybe even going out of the area where you're local to, but if it's the right family and it creates the break that you may need, then respite is absolutely key, as well as the support work. So how does it take us to the next stage, sadly, where you've got children who are starting to maybe deteriorate or having multiple hospital admissions, and then start planning for that eventual potential death? And sadly, we've recently had a child die who was with us in a hospice, but it was well planned. I think the carers were absolutely amazing, all the tragedy, but also the love and the kindness that everybody gives to each other through that process. But it's still a death, and whoever you are going to deal with it in your own particular way. So try to put in support, a bereavement support, to either the foster carers, their birth children, the other children looked after placed, because there'll be possibly other children living with that same household, and also the staff. So we offer support where it's wanted for the staff to have bereavement support if necessary. So we're trying to look at a whole holistic package of how to engage a family around a child who might be dying. And some of that is around, as I said earlier, having bereavement mentors like Sue to support other foster carers where maybe this is new. And sometimes there could be negativity about a child dying, but if you know the system and you know the structure that we're talking about, which is really what Together for Short Lives is really all about. It's about understanding and knowing that structure, and trying to use examples like this webinar to sort of highlight the challenges, but also the rewards of looking after a child with palliative care needs. So in terms of, I don't know if it's a good point in some of the challenges, Sue, that you've experienced when a child sadly dies, and that relationship about working with the health professionals and the advanced care planning, but also the birth family who rightly have their role in that child's life. It's their child, and what that's been like.
Yes, exactly. Well, I'm very fortunate because I've had it from all avenues. I've had parents, unfortunately, because of the circumstances, they've not been involved. I've had parents very heavily involved, and I've also had tricky situations where a child has been in hospital, they've not had a DNR, parents may not have seen that child for 8 months, and then suddenly the parents are in having conversations with doctors about what's happening for their future care plans, and we are left outside, not knowing what's going to happen with the child, even though we're the ones doing the 24/7 care, and then we get filled in afterwards. So yeah, certain things can be tricky. We have we have cultural differences as well, which we have to support families, and we follow those those situations. But yes, again, if a child is in hospital, it can be very tricky. You might have contact arrangements while you might only be seeing the parents, say once a month or once a week. Once they're in hospital, there may not be any contact arrangements, and you can find yourself sitting with a family all day long, every day, because their child is poorly and you are still their foster carer. So it can be very, very tricky. But can I also say it's not all doom and gloom either. It can be, and the majority of the time it is, it is a very loving and peaceful, and it can actually be a very positive situation, because where some of these parents may have been a bit negatively sort of seen in the beginning, you can build some great relationships with families. One of my families in particular, they had learning difficulties. Dad was very, very hostile in the beginning, and they had, on their contact arrangements, I had to have a supervisor here all the time, when he came to see his son. But then by the time, 3-4 months down the line, he was an angel. He was so lovely. He wasn't capable of looking after his child because of his learning difficulties. However, that didn't mean to say he didn't love his child. And he, fair play to him, he made all the right decisions. Sorry, that's my dog. He made all the right decisions in the end. And it was his death was a very positive situation. I was involved in all the funeral planning, again, because I was helping them along the way. We did memory work, so very positive experience with the family. And then, you have the other situations. I had a little girl that I'd cared for 3 years, very complex. We're talking, again, cultural. She was a Muslim little girl. Once she died, I was cut off, and that is what you expect to happen as a foster carer. Foster carers don't always understand that sometimes once that child has died, you are cut off. You have to always remember they're not your child. As hard as that is, they are not your child, no matter how many years you've loved them for. Because of the religious beliefs, the family were therefore allowed to remove her from the hospice. And then they had their funeral as they so wished, which is absolutely their right, because it is their daughter at the end of the day. But I don't look at that negatively. I look at that as a learning experience, and, it gave me experience for the next child. So, I've had many, many experiences.
And thank you, Sue. That sort of prompted us to, when we started to grow as an agency, we're having more and more children with life-limiting conditions or palliative care needs. You find you learn from your mistakes as well, and learn from any admissions that you might have in place. And it builds up over the years, that as you start to think of things that, on the emotional side of what's happening, but also even the practical side. What do you do about the Motability car? What do you do about any excess DLA that's sitting in children's accounts? And looked after children, that there's quite standard stuff that local authorities have to go through for a looked after child. But once the child has died in the ending of the care order, therefore the local authority have no legal rights regarding the child. You're then trying to work with the parents on, well, what do you do with all this money? What do you do with this equipment? What do you do with belongings? And so that's why it's quite crucial to support a family, the foster family and the birth family, where we can, and the local authority, through that exercise of trying to deal with the practical side as well as the emotional side of a child dying and what happens next. And so having the structures, the policies, the procedures, the guidance, the personnel in place, that's something that, whoever's doing this, it needs to be in place for it to work, and to make it as smooth and potentially as painless, but also celebratory as possible, where you want to celebrate a child's life who's actually achieved something. And as Sue said, sometimes we've had children who have been in hospital since birth, 9 months later, they're being placed. Oh, they won't survive till they're 1, and they're 2.5, and they're still there, or they may be 3 and then they pass away. But what? Actually, everybody is celebrating the fact that this child was a fighter and was able to carry on with their life as much as they could, even though they were maybe not expecting to achieve that outcome. So as it is sad, it also is loving, if I put it that way. So I'm just conscious of time and giving more space to, I know Sarah's coming in, and time for question and answers. So Joe, shall I leave it there for the moment?
That's great, Richard. Thank you so much, Richard and Sue, for sharing your experiences. We will now hand over to Sarah, who will talk about her experience at hospice, and also some of the practical considerations. And then we can have questions later. If anyone has questions as we go along, please feel free to put them in the chat, just so that you remember them as you go forward. But I'll hand over to Sarah now. Thank you.
Okay, hopefully that is working. I need a nod or a shake of the head from you, Joe. Yes, brilliant. Okay, thank you. Hi, everybody. I'm Sarah. I'm a social worker at Rainbows Hospice, as Joe said. I've been a social worker for 14 years now, so I've worked within the local authority for 10, and I've been a social worker for the child, been a social worker for the foster carers, and I'm now obviously at the hospice. So I'm going to talk a bit about the practical considerations around when we're talking about looked after children. Now, I'm actually going to echo some of what Richard said and some of what Sue said as well. So I'm going to try not to repeat what they've said. But just thinking about, when we're thinking about looked after children with palliative care needs who have life-limiting conditions, actually, there's very, very little that tells us how many we have across the country. There's no kind of specific research, there's no specific numbers about that. So we've got to kind of infer, and we've got to try and use experience to say, well, what do we know about them? Because actually, again, we don't know why they come into care. One of the things that I would say from my experience is actually the reasons that children with life-limiting conditions come into care can be very, very different from the general population of children. Obviously, there's that overlap around abuse and neglect, and particularly things like non-accidental injuries, which cause the life-limiting condition. But actually, the demands caring for a child with complex needs can make the picture very different. I know Sue used the example of the dad who had learning needs. It's not that he didn't have the ability to learn all the tasks to be able to look after that child. It's a very different, because potentially he might have been able to look after that child had they not had such significant medical needs. So we do have parents like that who are able to care for example, siblings perfectly well, but not for that child who has the complex needs. And it could also be to do with the parents' own needs. So as an example, we've had a child who had a parent who had her own medical needs. She was a wheelchair user. She needed carers to get herself in and out of bed. She had a son who developed a condition that meant that he was life limiting, but also that he needed to be able to be checked on overnight, that he needed medication to be able to be delivered. And actually, sadly, he then went into care, not because mum didn't want to look after him. They had a lovely, lovely bond, but she wasn't able to complete those extra tasks to do with the care of him becoming a child who had palliative care needs. We also have parents who burn out. There was, I don't know if people have heard of this, but there was a death in Manchester last year where a mum killed herself and she killed her child who had complex needs. And that was reported to be to do with carer burnout. So we know that services are becoming more limited, that support is becoming more limited, that it's becoming more difficult to get a significant package of care in the home. And it's something that means that potentially more and more people are at a point where they're not able to offer that care long term. And I think the other consideration as well is about children can be looked after for any length of time. They can be looked after for years, they can be looked after for their entire life, but they can also be looked after for weeks or days. You know, I know we've had a child who was looked after for less than 2 weeks, I want to say, because mum had an operation. She was able to care for him perfectly well. She was trained to care for him, but due to this operation, she wouldn't be mobile when she was recovering. So because there was nobody around who had the training to care for him and the ability to care for him in her personal network, he actually had to become looked after. For a child who didn't have complex needs, that might have been a very different situation. So there's lots of additional complexities for children who have complex needs and life-limiting conditions. I'm just trying to move this slide over and it's not going. Okay. Sorry, bear with me 1 second. Technology. There we go. Okay, I think we've done it. So the key words around this is parental responsibility. So I know when Sue was kind of sharing about being excluded from meetings that birth parents are part of, it's all about parental responsibility. What we can't assume is because a child is looked after that birth parents' parental responsibility still remains, regardless of how little contact they have with them. They still retain that parental responsibility, which is why they need to be involved in that decision making and those choices. And so it's always a balance, you know. So if a local authority has a child who's looked after, they have a majority share of the parental responsibility. So it doesn't take it away from the birth parents, it shares it, but it lets the local authority have the overriding decision. So for example, it might be about where they live, but equally birth parents might be able to express a preference about that. So it might be that their preference was they would like their religious beliefs to be followed, or their dietary restrictions to be followed. And those is all stuff that the local authority should be agreeing to, because they still have some decision-making power around that child and that young person. And actually how birth parents are engaged with is going to be different for every single child, because actually what works for one isn't always going to work for another. If you have parents, and I know certainly recently we've had parents who have just said, I don't want people to contact me. I don't want you to ring me. And we've had to figure out, well, how do you balance that? Because you have a duty to involve them, but actually then as a professional group, it's that agreement, well, one point of contact for that family. Maybe that one point of contact is the social worker. For other families, for parents that want to be really involved, who maybe are by that bedside when that child is in hospital, it might be different. They might want to be able to ask questions to the professionals. They might be able to want to be able to have that discussion to understand what's going on. And that might be a different process. But for each child or young person, it's that consistency through professionals who are involved in them as well. So that kind of discussion about, well, how are decisions being made? Who's making them? And do we understand on what basis different people are making decisions for that child or young person? I'm not going to go through all of these, but it is important to kind of vaguely understand what is in place that makes that child looked after. There's all sorts of different orders the court can make which grant parental responsibility or change parental responsibility. As I said, the only one which removes parental responsibility from birth parents is an adoption order. All the other orders that can be made, that's about sharing it amongst other people. But the local authority, generally, if the child's looked after, they'll either have an interim care order, a care order, or that child will be looked after under Section 20. Now, for the care order and the interim care order, that's, in terms of parental responsibility, that gives the same impact. That child is in the care of local authority, the local authority has a majority share of that decision-making power. So they can override decisions that are made. They can kind of say, no, I think this is the best one. But actually, it doesn't mean the local authority always has to use it in that way. So the best practice really is about agreement. It's about discussion, and it's about trying to get everyone on the same page. It's not going to be achievable all the time, but actually, particularly when making really significant decisions about children, so for example, about advanced care plans, you'd want everyone to kind of come to the same decision, to have agreement. But actually, again, when making those significant decisions, what you'd hope for is that consultation with the people who know that child or young person best. So if that child's in foster care, with the foster carers, if that child's in residential care, with excuse me, with the people that are caring for them day to day, you know, to get what's that child's voice, what would they say, you know, how much can they express their thoughts about this, and how can we involve them as much as they can be, and what they want in their choices. So it's not about being able to dictate, it's about trying to have that relationship that can form agreement and come together in the best interests of that child or young person. Right, sorry, bear with me. Okay, so one of the things that I think is really important to understand about is about delegated authority. And I'm sure Richard and Sue will be very familiar with delegated authority and how that works for them. Each local authority will have their own forms. They will have, but they should all be doing a delegated authority form. And that's to make it really clear to everybody, what can the foster carer agree to? What can't they agree to? So if you're working with a looked after child and talking to the foster carer, they'll probably have a really good idea of what they can agree to and what they can't agree to. And that'll be all through the delegated authority. Generally speaking, on a really broad brush kind of way, generally speaking, routine medical appointments will probably be included in a delegated authority. Things like immunisations, things like dental appointments. Excuse me. But actually, for each child or young person, it might be slightly different. I've just realised I forgot to talk about section 20. So I'll just do a recap, just go back a little bit and say that some children can be looked after under section 20, and hopefully that'll be a familiar, for some of you, that'll be something that's familiar. So that's part of the Children Act, which is kind of the main act that governs kind of looking after, like, the children becoming looked after. And what that means is the parent has agreed for their child to become looked after. So it might be that a parent recognises that they can't meet the care needs of their child. Maybe their needs have changed significantly after an episode in hospital. Maybe it's that they've realised, like the mum I referenced earlier, she can't do the medication for that child. Maybe parents are saying they just can't cope, they just can't do it anymore. They can then sign a section 20, and that is giving permission for that child to be looked after by the local authority. So they are sharing their parental responsibility with the local authority. And the reason it's important to understand that this is slightly different from an order by the court is that that section 20 can be withdrawn at any time. So that parent who signed that form can go back and say, no, changed my mind. And the local authority don't have the right to keep that child in care any longer. Now, obviously, there can be discussions about what's in the best interest of the child and, you know, not doing things abruptly. But unless they then go to court and get an order, they can't keep that child in care. And the reason that I'm talking about this now, and it's prompted me to remember that I forgot to talk about it, is that what is delegated might be slightly different if a child is on section 20. So it might be that parent retains more control of those decisions. They might say, actually, I've agreed this. I don't want you to get haircuts for him. I want to be the one who decides how my child looks. So I'm going to keep that and I'm going to do that for them. It might be slightly different things that are important to them, but equally they retain more of that power and control and decision making through the Section 20. So actually, you need to be aware on what basis is this child looked after? How does that impact what is being done? Because actually, in the best interest of the child, if that child could come out of care any minute, that parent really needs to come along this journey with whatever you're doing with them, because they could be dealing with it at any moment, potentially. So back to the delegated authority, actually, it's important to understand, what I'm doing with this child, can the foster carer consent to it? Do I need to get the local authority? Do I need to get the parents? Do I need to get both? Excuse me. Or has this been consent, have they given consent for the foster carer to make these kind of decisions? And actually, one of the important things is consistency. How is it being dealt with by other people? How is it being done? What benefits this parent? If you have a parent who has particular additional needs themselves, do you need to think about those? So, for example, for accessibility, for appointments, for, if a parent has a learning need, do you need to think about the kind of information you're providing and what format you're providing it, so they can access it, as well as providing different information in a different format for the other people involved in the decision. So it's always worth asking the question, if you're asking somebody to make a decision for their child, do you know what basis they're making that decision? And nobody's going to get offended if you ask. It's that kind of, you can have the curiosity to say, okay, he's looked after. What's in place for him? Can I understand that? Like, what does that mean? Who's in charge of making this decision or that decision that impacts what I'm doing with them? Excuse me. And the last thing I wanted to kind of think about was about the complications at end of life. And it can be more complicated at end of life for a looked after child. Some of it will depend on birth parents, their relationship with the foster carer, their relationship with professionals, their relationship with the child. Contact may be completely different. I think, like Sue says, you could have a family that see a child even like once every 3 months, once every 6 months, who are then beside their bed, 24/7, and having to deal with the difference that is. You could have families where there's not much contact because of risks that they may pose, and there might be a decision that they should have more contact because there's a decision that the child is at end of life, and it might be in everyone's best interest for that contact to increase. But then there's a question of, what does that look like? Where is it? Who's supporting that? And is it in the best interest of that child or young person? We know at end of life, children's needs can change significantly, and how they express, they may not be able to express themselves the way they normally do. What are their wishes and feelings around that additional contact? And if they're not able to express that, is something happening that we think they might not have wanted? And how does that sit with everybody who is trying to look after them? Also need to think about place of death. We kind of think, well, people should have a choice of their place of death if they can. But actually, there might be, for foster carers, if you're thinking about contact, it might be really difficult to have certain families in your home. It's the foster carer's home. They should absolutely retain control of who is there, who is part of that. There may be risks to do with birth parents that mean it's entirely inappropriate. But that means that as a place of death, potentially the home then becomes not an option, even if it's potentially what that child or young person might have wanted. We also need to think about what that means overall. It might be that even a hospice isn't an option. I certainly know there's been concerns before about children and young people coming to us whose parents might have posed a risk, and whether we could facilitate that and keep that child and our staff safe as a result of that. And I think the last thing as well is funeral arrangements. And I know Sue spoke about this already, but actually there's no there's some guidance, there's some guidance that applies to England and Wales that suggests that the local authority should play a role in arranging the funeral. But actually, at the end of the day, parental responsibility and court orders, they don't last after death. The local authority doesn't have a right to make those decisions and to make those choices. And it might be incredibly complicated. Actually social workers, a lot of social workers are probably not going to have had experience of dealing with this before, so navigating the system that's in place, navigating decision making. Often what happens is birth parents then make the decision about the funeral, and that can exclude foster carers, exclude long-term carers from residential homes, and that can really emotionally impact. But I think more so those decisions, if they're being made by family who had limited contact with that child or young person, those can sometimes also not be in line with what that child or young person might have chosen for themselves, and the impact of that on those caring for them can be really significant, not feeling like they've got the ending that they wanted. So there's lots of additional complications for looked after children, but it's just about understanding, I think from a practical perspective, it's understanding who can make decisions, what basis they're making those decisions, and making sure that we know that for sure, rather than assuming, and about having a consistent approach, making sure that we're working with everybody important to that child or young person, and all listening as a multi-agency group if we can. Okay, I know the time as well, so I'm going to stop.